That God's desires would be written on our hearts, this has always been comforting. That the seed must die in order to produce fruit, that it can't just painlessly transform into a fruit-producing tree. This, however, is challenging and not quite as comforting. Yet as Jesus approaches his passion, he speaks these words that teach his disciples what could possibly be a painful truth. Yet these are the same words that have inspired and that have consoled his followers throughout the centuries. Unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains just a grain of wheat. But if it falls to the ground, if it dies, if it lets go of itself, then it produces much fruit. How is it that a seed that lets go of itself and dies can become a source of hope and a source of meaning for so many? We trust, and I believe we know, that it is so because if we search within ourselves, we know and discover that very truth. Today's reading from St. John marks a decisive moment in the gospel. Jesus' passion is about to begin. Jerusalem is filled with the people who are preparing for the festivities of Passover. Yet Jesus knows what is coming as he enters the city. He is aware of what his ministry within the last few years has led to, and he is aware, therefore, as well of the consequences. Here in John, Jesus prepares his disciples to acknowledge the truth, to acknowledge what is going to happen to him, as well as to acknowledge and to recognize what is the way for them in this way of discipleship. In the second reading from Hebrews, we hear that Jesus learned obedience from what he suffered. What he suffered is not limited to the passion. Jesus learned obedience from staying the course, from continuing to proclaim in word and in deed God's longing for a world of truth, for a world of true freedom, for a world of compassion and solidarity with the least among us. And he continued to proclaim this even when he was questioned, and when he was questioned by those who seemingly would have been the people who should have understood and have contemplated and have prayed over God's very plan for our world. He was accused of blasphemy. He was accused of speaking of God in an outrageous form as a God of life and a God of love. It was not the God of life or of love that frightened them so much, but rather what this would mean, because it demands conversion. It demands change. It would also require of them that which is most frightening, confronting and then letting go of a grasp of control over a situation, confronting and then letting go of fears, of uncertainties, of immaturity, of a self-reliance that denies any possibility of a true and necessary relationship with God. When Scripture tells us that Jesus learned obedience from what he suffered, we understand that he learned obedience by what he lived day in and day out. Jesus learned to hear, to listen to the voice of God in the midst of many other voices, many voices who questioned and accused out of fear. He learned obedience to love, even when that love that would risk healing the broken and saving the lost would bring him condemnation. Jesus learned obedience to the point of death. Jesus learned obedience to the point of life. The grain of wheat did not begin to die on Good Friday. The grain of wheat had been giving of itself throughout and would now do so to the end. At the moment where we meet Jesus today, in this intimate preparation for the Passion, Jesus accepts that this is the only way to truth. This is where such love to the end will necessarily lead him. The love for us that he had consistently chosen would lead him to the completion of that love. The law that we hear of in our first reading today had already been written on his heart. A law of self-giving love, practiced and rehearsed and consistently chosen, and now well aware of the consequences. As we draw near to Holy Week, the question for us becomes this: Has our Lenten journey taught us to stay the course as well? Has it taught us patience? Has it taught us hope? Has it drawn us to long for God and to share in God's longing for our world in the midst of our most normal and daily routines and realities? Have the practices of Lent led us further our experience of love, of our giving of love in a self-giving way in our day-to-day life? Has our Lenten fast revealed to us the real possibility of delaying gratification in a culture that teaches us and speaks of immediate wants and needs? Has our offering, whatever it is that we have done or have given for the benefit of others, been a grain of wheat that produces much fruit? Has it been something that has created community in a world that longs for interconnectedness? So often we hope for key moments that will turn us around, epiphanies that will reveal a great truth to us. Yet God has always chosen and will continue to choose subtler ways. In the sacredness of daily tasks and conversations that gradually begin to help us to see more fully, that challenge us to ask deeper questions, to reflect more deeply, that invite us to simply be and to be well in the presence of another. It is in the sacredness of the daily where we too learn obedience, where we learn not to be afraid neither of the new nor of the ordinary, where we become willing to risk loving in such a way that we too might even be accused of being a follower of Christ. Something has been written on our hearts this Lent. May it not remain just a grain of wheat.